Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our briefing, The Columbia River. This panel is the third installment in our ongoing briefing series about resilient and healthy rivers. EESI, let me introduce myself. I'm Dan Brissett, the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. And EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked to provide science-based information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We always strive to be timely, relevant, accessible, and practical, and we put a lot of thought into our resources to always be science-based and ready when congressional staff need the information. And this early in the year, there's a lot of change and transition as new members are getting situated and new staff are eager to dig in and get to work. In addition to river health and resilience, we cover a lot of other topics at EESI, and I hope everyone takes a moment to RSVP for our upcoming Congressional Climate Camp briefing series. The first Congressional Climate Camp on January 29th will be an interactive refresher on the drivers of climate change and the latest deployable solutions to address the challenge. And it will be extremely cool. It'll be very interactive, very, very cool, in person on the Hill. Everything is always available online at www.eesi.org. You can visit us to RSVP for Climate Camp, all of our briefings, upcoming briefings, including additional rivers briefings. And the best way to keep up with what we do is by subscribing to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions, which the latest issue just came out yesterday. The goal of this briefing series is to highlight solutions and examine issues impacting U.S. rivers and the communities situated along them. In 2024, we covered the Mississippi River and the Tennessee River, and both of those briefings are available to watch online at www.eesi.org. After our look at the Columbia River today, our next briefing will be about the Colorado River on February 19th, and then we have more briefings after that. Sign up for the whole series that is set to run for a few more months to make sure you receive presentation materials and summary notes as well for each briefing. The Columbia River flows through British Columbia and Canada, as well as Oregon and Washington State. It is an important source of food, drinking water, irrigation, recreation, and clean energy for communities in the Pacific Northwest. Climate change has led to and exacerbated problems along the river and in the broader basin, like estuary and habitat loss, toxic algal blooms, low water levels, and diminished fish populations, highlighting the importance of finding science-based solutions to these issues. Now, with just about any EESI briefing on just about any topic, we are constrained by time and the number of panelists that we can realistically fit into 90 minutes. And today is no different. And there are perspectives about some issues, including some controversial issues, that will not be represented in our briefing today. The generation of clean energy from hydropower facilities to power homes and businesses in the region is one such issue that's controversial. And we regularly feature hydropower and pump storage in our educational resources because of their potential as a climate solution, including in a briefing last year about dam removal and river restoration, and on a panel at the 2024 Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Expo and Policy Forum. Dams will come up during our briefing today, although this briefing is about much, much more than just that. It's also a good chance to remind everyone that while EESI briefings are a great place to start learning about a climate change topic, there is always more research to do, more information to uncover, and more people to talk with. You can also ask us questions. We will take questions from our online audience today, and you can do that by emailing us at ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. And you can reach out to me or one of my colleagues. All of our email addresses and phone numbers are listed on our webpage with more questions, and we'll try to help you get to as close to the right answer as possible. And beyond questions, we're always taking ideas for future briefings, as well as fact sheets, articles, and podcasts. So please reach out to one of us and share your feedback. Speaking of feedback, there's a link or a QR code, I should say, on the screen right now, and that will lead you to our survey. We do a survey during each one of our briefings. If you would like to take that survey now, that would be great. If you want to wait till the end of the briefing, that's okay too. We read every response. It only takes about 2 minutes or so, and you can share all sorts of feedback on the audio quality, video quality, as well as all the other things I asked for a moment ago. And a reminder about questions. Again, you can submit questions by emailing us at ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. You can also follow us on social media at EESI Online. We'll be doing real-time coverage of our briefing today on our Instagram story, as well as Blue Sky. We have 5 tremendous panelists today who will talk all about the issues they're working on in the Columbia River and in the greater region. And our first speaker today is Jeremy Takala. Jeremy is chair of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. He was nominated in 2020 to serve as a tribal councilman for the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation. Chairing the Fish and Wildlife, Law and Order, and Legislative Committees keeps Jeremy pretty busy these days, and prior to his time in office, he worked 12 years for the Yakima Klickitat Fisheries Project at the Klickitat River Research Monitor evaluation as a fisheries technician. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us at our briefing today. I'm looking forward to your presentation, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, EESI, and happy to be here and join some great folks here on the panel and presentations that will be presented today. Again, my name is Jeremy Takala. My Indian name is Bakhanashet. I come from the Kamithpa band, one of the 14 tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation. So as mentioned before, the Columbia River is something that the tribes, not only Yakima, but the Confederate tribes of the Warm Springs, the Umatilla, and Nez Perce tribes of 1855, who recognizes the usual rights and accustomed heirs to partake in harvesting of our salmon and other anadromous residential species. So this work is very close and dear to our heart. Again, and moving forward to ensure that we have those resources available for the future generations, and not only just tribal communities, but also the Pacific region as a whole. So I'm sure folks have heard the progress that was made with the outgoing administration. This has been a very tremendous amount of work, many hours, many trips, many education, and more so developing a strategy to move forward and to avoid just a threshold of threatened or extinct species. So the work that we've been highlighting a lot is the Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative. And in this slide here, just an overview of some of the hydro systems within the Columbia River Basin itself. And we know historically that the largest salmon produced in a river in the lower 48 states was the Columbia River. Before the inundation of different falls, different fisheries, it was a free-flowing, cool river that was once thriving to produce roughly around 10 to 18 million salmon for the region, and also providing steelhead, lamprey, sturgeon, and many other food sources that were cultural resources that sustained our way of life. Today, with our work with the Columbia River Tribal Fish Commission and the respective tribes, we've only now currently see about 1 to 2 million. That's on good years. With only about 250,000 of natural origin spawners. And working with some of the folks out, such as the Northwest Power Council, it's been assessed that the hydroelectric dams reduce our salmon steelhead runs by 5 to 11 million each year. So really, it involves the hydro operations in a manner of spill control, flex spill, of course, with the pressures of climate change, invasive species, predation issues overall. Next slide, please. This is just another overview of the Columbia Basin Treaty tribes. Again, we have the Governor Isaac Stevens Treaty that has the specific region language that each of these tribes here have the rights to hunt, gather, and fish at all usual and accustomed areas. And really what stemmed from that was, the different court cases that involve our tribal members, specifically Yakimas, such as the Winans case, the So Happy case, which eventually became known as the US v. Oregon. So really that kind of set precedent as, the tribes being co-managers of the species. So moving forward, that's when the Columbia River Tribal Fish Commission was developed to provide technical support amongst the 4 tribes, enforcement, but of course, utilization of the treaty fishing access sites that are on both sides of the Columbia River. So just want to give you guys an overview of where each of the current reservations, but also the ceded territories that each of the 4 tribes have. Jumping a little ahead, the next slide talks about our tribal treaty rights. in the Columbia River, but also recognized in other areas such as Willamette, the Cowlitz, up north, the Leavenworth icicle fishery that occurs specifically for Yakimas, but also even our own tributary fisheries that are me as a fish and wildlife chair and working with colleagues, our staff, try to ensure that there is a fishery availability to provide for the different ceremonies, and more so just in general for people's homes. I mean, we are um, historically, ate fish on a day-to-day basis, and that goes hand in hand with our different first foods that still to this day sustain us. Although it's not, um, great, there's challenges, but we still nevertheless advocate for those existence of our foods. So in recognition to what the treaties were negotiated that we have the reiteration of the right of taking fish all usual and custom places in common with the citizens of the territory. The next slide shows what I mentioned earlier is the salmon decline, returning species to the Columbia River Basin. As you can see, as I mentioned, 10 to 18 million given the different stocks. And then, there's by the 1930s, we've had the construction of hydro systems, specifically Bonneville. And so there was, fish ladders that were taken into consideration, but also still development of how those ladders would work because, it's been clearly identified that not all species, native species, utilize the fish ladders such as lampreys. So there's still development of how fish passage improvements can be made. The next slide, where we had talked about the different tributaries, not only the Columbia River Basin itself, but also the tributary of the Snake River, what it provides to the basin itself. So we know that Snake River salmon are in crisis. We know that there's been fish runs that has been decimated due to hydro operations or no fish passage. Snake River is identified as the largest contributor to the Columbia. We know it contains in the headwaters pristine habitat where salmon could thrive and spawn in. We know that there's success stories that can help initiate and to ensure that Snake River stocks can thrive. I've heard, we've always share the same compassionate story that, we're at a very particular moment in time where we need to do things differently. The Snake River has a quasi-extinction threshold where of less than 50% of returning spawners per year come back to the Snake River. We know that 19% of Snake River steelhead are at or below the quasi-extinction threshold. So, looking at the CBRI, we wanted to do something differently. And that involved the six sovereigns, meaning Oregon, Washington, the four tribes. We took a strategic approach looking at what is the urgent action needs. We need a unified approach. We can't be, divided and conquer. We need to have a unified approach to express the concerns for the whole region as so that everyone can be involved. We want to also recognize the obligations to the tribes. Next slide, please. And also community resilience. We're in a moment in time where, again, climate pressures are here. We're seeing the extensive amount of development that has direct impacts to our tree resources. Next slide, please. And so, and moving forward, next slide, we wanted to secure the United States government's commitments to help position the restoration initiative to advance a durable, long solution or strategy to restore our fish runs, to look at champions for salmon recovery to work in the Columbia River Basin, to avoid not only the threshold, but to look at healthy, abundant populations to support tribe culturally, subsistence, but also economically for the whole region. What the production that the tribes produce in the Columbia River Basin also supports the ocean fisheries. So a lot of this work goes hand in hand for the advancement of everyone, the stakeholders across the region. The next slide talks about our objectives. Again, healthy abundant levels to assure ecosystem health, to halt the decline. We can't continue to do business as usual because we are a living example of seeing fish populations go downhill. Operations have to take, I guess, look at minimize additional generational decline of fish populations. So having an interaction with folks to have a understand would help advance some of these objectives here. Next slide, we're looking at quick and just clean energy transition. We know there's a demand for power. We know there's a population increase in the region, but let the tribes have a seat at the table to ensure that we can talk about appropriate site proposals. We want to look at renewables that don't have a direct impact with some of our work surrounding the Columbia River Basin. Talking about an urgent comprehensive action. What can the different federal agencies do to change things to help ensure that this objectives can get across to the finish line? And again, going back to honor and trust, the treaty, trust, and obligations. So the next slide, again, just kind of goes over talking about our recommended approach, identify a feasible approach to, help ensure that the upper Columbia reintroduction gets across the finish line as well. Advance key elements concurrently and immediately, looking at the low-hanging fruit and looking at the 10-year fish needs plan for the mid-Columbia. The next slide, we talk about initial federal commitments. We celebrated with this administration with an MOU last February, asking that these agencies commit to do some internal changes to ensure that this will best support to Columbia River Basin and its effort. We talked about the Resilience Columbia Basin includes a package of initial federal actions. While the MOU remains, we want to ensure that this work moves forward without any direct impacts to, delay. We talk about doubling of funding. We talk about lower snake dam removal. We need to depoliticize these kind of efforts to ensure that we're looking at the clear, bigger picture to ensure that salmon is going to thrive in a region. Salmon is going to be there for each and every one of us, and most importantly, for our future generations. Challenges ahead of us, we're looking at support to secure, at least for the region. We know the governor of Oregon and Washington took an executive order to ensure that this work doesn't go anywhere in the region, that we're going to look for additional support and, of course, navigate through the challenges that we may see, with the new administration. So this work will continue. We want to ensure that, if there's any additional support, that we're happy to work with folks who want to support the six sovereigns. So in the interest of time, I want to thank each and every one of you for your patience. And of course, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer at a later time. And I want to share too that this presentation, we did do a congressional staffers presentation back at the Capitol a few months ago. So if there's folks online, I'm sure that you guys seen this presentation before. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was a great presentation. Also a reminder, presentation materials from Jeremy as well as the rest of our speakers will be available on the briefing page. So if you've RSVP'd for the briefing today, that's great. If you haven't, you can visit the briefing page, you can download the slides. RSVPing to our briefings means that you get the reminders and the links and everything, or links to the livecast page. It also means you get written summary notes a couple weeks after the briefing is over. So in addition to Jeremy's slides and everyone else's slides will be posted on the briefing page. Eventually, there'll also be summary notes, and of course, the archive of the webcast itself. So, thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for your presentation today. Our second panelist of the day is Miles Johnson. Miles is the legal director at Columbia Riverkeeper. Miles works to reduce water pollution and restore salmon by enforcing the Clean Water Act and providing legal counsel for Columbia Riverkeeper's campaigns. Before law school, Miles worked as a fisheries researcher in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. As an enthusiastic fish eater, Miles is personally invested in ensuring that we can all eat fish caught in the Columbia without endangering the health of our families. I'm sure the fish see things a little bit differently, Miles, but that's fine. Again, not all perspectives are represented on our briefing today. But Miles, I'll turn it over to you. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Dan. Yeah, as you said, my name is Miles Johnson. I'm the legal director for Columbia Riverkeeper. Thank you, yeah, so much to EESI for having me today. Thank you to everyone in the audience who's taking the time to, learn or refresh about the Columbia River and the issues facing it. A little background on Columbia Riverkeeper. We're an organization that works up and down the Columbia to protect water quality and to make sure that everyone in the basin has the opportunity to, experience the benefits of an amazing river, go swimming, go fishing, eat fish without fear of toxic contamination. And I definitely count myself among those people. This is a picture of my son Malcolm's first salmon on the Columbia last fall. Big moment for him, big moment for our family. And I think for a lot of people, salmon and the Columbia are, inextricably linked. And, my background is in fisheries, so I'm kind of a fish nerd. I think the fish themselves are amazing, but I think it's the connection between salmon and people, salmon and the ecosystem, salmon and orcas, salmon and communities, and especially the connection between salmon and tribal cultures and tribal nations. It's those connections that make salmon, this iconic symbol of the Columbia. And as Councilman Takala explained, those connections are being strained because we're having trouble recovering wild, abundant populations of salmon in the Columbia. I think those connections are also being strained because there's real concern about toxic pollution in the Columbia that can impair people's ability to use the river and eat fish from the river. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. So, in different parts of the Columbia, there are different fish advisories and different levels of contamination. And in some places, it's in fact not advisable at all to eat resident fish that spend their whole lives in the Columbia River. Salmon, because of their life cycle and the fact that they spend a lot of their lives in the ocean, are actually usually healthier to eat than some of the resident fish. But recent testing has revealed a lot of those same pollutants of concern in the bodies of salmon as well, at levels that should be concerning to people who eat salmon on a regular basis. So, how do we address these challenges? How do we get pollution out of the river? How do we keep more pollution from going into the river? That's a longer conversation in the next, 5 or 10 minutes. I'd like to focus on Columbia Riverkeeper's efforts, in partnership with tribes and states and other NGOs to address some toxic legacy sites on the Columbia. The first one of those kind of case studies is called Bradford Island. Bradford Island was recently designated on the national priorities list as a Superfund site. Bradford Island is basically an island in the Columbia River at Bonneville Dam, which is about 40 miles east upstream of Columbia or of Portland and Vancouver. And during and after the construction of Bonneville Dam, the Army Corps of Engineers disposed of a bunch of construction materials that was laden with PCB contamination at Bradford Island and the water surrounding Bradford Island. And that's led, decades later to some of the highest levels of PCB contamination in resident fish and in sediments at Bradford Island that we've seen really anywhere in the United States. So, this has been understood to be a problem for a while. Several years ago, Yakima Nation led an effort that Columbia Riverkeeper and others joined to get Bradford Island designated on the national priority list for cleanup. They were eventually joined in that effort by the states of Oregon and Washington, many of the members of Congress from the Pacific Northwest. That was a big effort to get this site the recognition it deserved, and the funding that it deserves for cleanup. As many of you probably know, getting a site listed is really just the beginning of the process. Circular cleanup is long, it's technically complex. If you go to the next slide, we're working with communities along the river there, to ensure that, those voices are represented in plans for cleanup. And I want to stress that Bradford Island, it is a place where a lot of tribal fishing occurs. It's also a place where a lot of non-tribal fishing occurs. The, Bonneville Dam area is a place where a lot of people can access the Columbia, go fishing from the bank. It's near, major population centers like East Portland, East Vancouver. And a lot of the people who fish there, are, maybe not, English may not be their first language. It may be Spanish, it may be Russian, it may be Vietnamese. But this is a very important place for people who want to come and fish for salmon, sturgeon, bass, walleye in the Columbia. There's just a lot of fishing effort that goes on there. And part of what Columbia Riverkeeper has tried to do, as you can see, because I've been cribbing slides from my coworkers, is approach those communities in ways that are going to result in real opportunities for them to engage in cleanup plans, including by offering bilingual outreach and support. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about Hanford, which without Hanford, I don't think any discussion of toxic cleanup on the Columbia would be complete. As many of you probably know, Hanford is the most contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. It's where our government did a lot of the heavy lifting of the Manhattan Project and developing our country's nuclear arsenal and nuclear capabilities. Unfortunately, a lot of the toxic and radioactive waste that was generated in that effort remains at Hanford, in the ground, in buildings, in tanks that are leaking into groundwater, and in some cases, some of that contamination is leaking directly into the Columbia River. And it's an immensely technical challenge. Hanford cleanup has been something that Columbia Riverkeeper has focused on for the last 25 years, advocating for better, faster cleanup. Over the last several years, we've been honored to do more and more of that work in partnership with the Yakama Nation's Hanford Cleanup Program. I think we've added value to that partnership by, going into schools throughout the basin, but really focusing on schools with large populations of tribal members around Hanford site, so that we can, really grow the next generation of Hanford advocates, because this is going to be, already has been and will continue to be, a multi-generational cleanup process. Columbia Riverkeeper also, partners with Yakama Nation to lead events where people can get out and actually see parts of the Hanford site that are difficult to access, get out on the river, get out on parts that have been designated a national monument, and rebuild those connections between people in the Columbia Basin and the Hanford site. And I think what Columbia Riverkeeper has really learned most of all from that partnership, and working closely with the Yakama Nation, is the bigger picture on Hanford cleanup. It's so easy to get lost in the technical challenges, in the weeds. What Yakama Nation's Hanford program brings to this is a focus and an understanding on the idea that Hanford is not just a site that needs to be cleaned up. It is a landscape of immense cultural and spiritual and ecological value. It is the traditional wintering ground for many of the tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation. The Columbia River through Hanford is the last free-flowing stretch of the Columbia from Bonneville Dam to the Canadian border. And not coincidentally, it's also home to the largest and most robust population of wild spawning Chinook salmon in the Columbia Basin. It's an oversimplification, but I think it's true that Hanford is kind of the best and the worst of the Columbia all rolled into one. And I think in terms of what the federal government can do to continue its obligation to clean up, the mess we've created at Hanford, we really need to work on resisting efforts to essentially build a fence around Hanford and put up a sign and walk away. Unfortunately, that's been the tact that the first Trump administration took. That is the tact that is more or less laid out in Project 2025. Hanford is both too dangerous and too important for us to, basically try to walk away from it. If you go to the next slide real quickly, I don't want to end this presentation without thanking and recognizing the tremendous effort that's gone into cleaning up toxics on the Columbia over the last 4 years. There's just been a huge influx of resources and attention through EPA and flowing to tribes and NGOs and states to, understand and characterize toxic pollution. And for Columbia Riverkeeper, that's also meant opportunities for us to bring environmental education and connect people with the river that we otherwise wouldn't have had. I think we brought over 600 school children to the Columbia River, presented in English and in Spanish to, highlight the challenges, but also build the next generation of advocates. So I'll stop there. There's one more slide, dams and hydropower. I think Councilman Takala hit that pretty hard. I'm sure Sarah will as well. And anything I can say, I'll probably get in response to questions. So again, thank you so much. And yeah, really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, Miles. That was a good presentation. And Miles's slides are on the website as well. I wanted to remind everyone that we'll have some time for Q&A today. So if you have questions for Miles or others, you can send us an email. And the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. Unfortunately, Jeremy had to leave us for another commitment. He had an executive committee meeting today, I think it was, and so he had to leave us a little early. If you have questions specifically for Jeremy, we'll do our best to get those questions to him, and then we'll just manage the rest of the Q&A amongst the 5 of us, 4 panelists plus me. But I won't really answer any questions. I'll do the asking. That brings us to our third panelist of the day. Jackson Blalock is the Marine and Estuarian Resilience Program Manager for the Pacific Conservation District. Jackson assists communities of Southwest Washington State to adapt to environmental challenges like sea level rise, erosion, and habitat loss. His work focuses on collaborative processes that address today's needs while anticipating future conditions. His past experience includes coastal hazards, resilience assistance with Washington Sea Grant, along with rebuilding and water management efforts in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. Jackson is also our top candidate for best background during the Zoom call today. So congratulations on that, Jackson, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Hey there, everyone. I'm Jackson Blalock with Pacific Conservation District, as you heard. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'll be sharing an example of community-driven climate resilience project development along the Lower Columbia River, also involving the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership and Washington Sea Grant. Next. I'll discuss project context, methods, a bit on outcomes, or mostly outcomes, and some lessons learned for effective coastal resilience work. Next. Our goals were to recover Lower Columbia River native habitats and reduce impacts of flooding, coastal hazards, and climate change on communities and ecosystems. We worked to do this through proactive and collaborative planning, engaging community members in action-oriented workshops, identifying multi-benefit nature-based projects to address issues, and identifying and assisting local individuals and organizations to champion this work. Next. Here you see a map of Western Washington State with the Puget Sound at the top and the Pacific Coast region highlighted in blue on the left. The Columbia River makes the border with Oregon on the bottom or south side, and today I'll focus on the southwest corner of the state in red, covering Pacific County and western Wahkiakum County's shores on the Columbia River, which are traditional lands of the Chinook Indian Nation. This project was preceded by Washington Sea Grant's development of tools and assistance for hazard resilience planning and projects, funded through multiple NOAA grants. Washington Sea Grant provides extension services out of the University of Washington College of the Environment. Next. The Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, who you'll hear from, had recently mapped sea level rise impacts to wetlands across the estuary using projections from Washington Sea Grant. This showed impacts to critical habitats for endangered salmon, green sturgeon, and as well as other fish and wildlife. Next. Pacific Conservation District led local engagement for the project, building from past outreach and nature-based erosion control efforts along Baker Bay. We are a subdivision of state government based in Pacific County and work with local landowners, jurisdictions, tribes, and anyone else to conserve natural resources. We are locally led by an elected board made up of farmers representing cranberry, shellfish, cattle, and other industries. And importantly, we live amongst the people we serve and are almost entirely grant funded. Next. Actually, I think you're already there. Here's the Washington side of the Lower Columbia River in yellow, which hosts a convergence of tides, Columbia River flows, smaller yet still substantial rivers, storms, and watersheds receiving over 100 inches of annual rainfall. Our team got a grant to look at how potential sea level rise impacts relate to existing issues and, importantly, to develop tangible projects that address present and future issues. This was led by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund. Grays Bay here is in Wahkiakum County on the right, and downstream on the left is Baker Bay in Pacific County, hence the name Bay to Bay for the project. Next. The region is rural, dependent on fishing, crabbing, and timber, geographically isolated hours from interstates and urban areas of Seattle or Portland, and has only one bridge to access shopping and medical services in Oregon. Critical regional transportation routes run along the Columbia River, top right, while on the bottom right, Grays Bay has a mosaic of agricultural lands and spruce swamps, providing habitat for juvenile salmon transitioning to salt water. The city of Ilwaco is the only incorporated city in the project area in the top left, and the bottom left is the town of Chinook and the port of Chinook. Next. Here you see the port of Ilwaco during a king tide. Note the processing plant at the water level, fish processing. This port helps drive the state's economy for commercial and recreational seafood, employing 1 of 6 people in a county with some of the state's highest unemployment rates. Pacific and Wahkiakum County's limited staff capacity means that much hazards and habitat work is performed by well-intentioned yet non-local organizations as a missed opportunity for grants to feed the local economy and low tax base. Next. Here you see Rosberg Hall along or here in the Grays River. This is the community center where we hosted half of our workshops. Pacific and Wahkiakum counties have some of the highest percentages of population living in floodplains compared to other Washington state counties. Since 2005, there have been 18 federally declared disasters here due to flooding and storms. Documented increases in sea level and frequency of extreme rain events will make these issues worse. All these factors contribute to the area's high vulnerability to today's hazards and future climate impacts. Next. In 2022, preceded by periodic engagement, our team regularly attended local meetings and initiated conversations and site visits while diving into past work in the area. Next, public workshops saw community members scope out 12 projects for habitats and hazards resilience wrapped into a plan for advancing this work. Last, we assisted successful grant proposals for 4 of those projects, leading to $1.5 million in funds alongside future assistance from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Other projects are on the back burner until partners have the bandwidth for next steps. Next. During workshops, participants mapped out impacts from changing water levels, shared local priorities, and developed multi-benefit ideas. Workshops involved local residents, representatives from local, state, and federal and tribal jurisdictions, and more. Next. Workshop participants also shared on-the-ground perspectives. This photo shows the Coast Guard airlifting a driver out of a 2023 flood in Grays River taken by a first responder who attended workshops. Next. The 12 projects generated by the workshops varied in complexity. This here erosion control project along the Chinook shoreline will work with the Port of Chinook and hopefully the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to place dredged sediment for shoreline restoration. Initial design and assessment here is being funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Next. This work also benefits state agencies such as Washington State Department of Transportation, who became involved in this project after realizing it could help reduce flooding along US 101 along the Columbia River. Next. Other proposed projects are much more complex, involving large sites, many partners, and a range of mutually reinforcing actions. This watershed-wide flood reduction project received a state grant to initial collaborative conversations, but will require significant additional investment to support habitat gains and protections of public infrastructure and private lands. Next. Similarly, participants recognize the need to move upland out of harm's way for both present and future water levels, which can also support large habitat gains. In Washington, this forward-thinking approach of moving or expanding upland has only been undertaken by federally recognized tribes. Upland development for all communities along the Washington or Oregon coast is also relevant given the tsunami risk we face. We look to federal agencies to help us develop holistic approaches for the investment and coordination required for the long-term sustainability of our communities. Next. In addition to the practical lessons we learned, here are lessons learned for a federal audience. Next. Pacific Conservation District became, effective adaptation and restoration requires local collaboration and leadership, ensuring project dollars go directly to communities as much as possible. Pacific Conservation District became the practical lead of the project, leveraging local trust, contextual awareness, and sustained engagement with landowners. Our grant partners were large organizations with more capacity who managed the grant and helped in ways we were not able to. Second, scale and complexity of this work will require multiple generations. Applied science, creative thinking, and trades education can build tomorrow's local leaders for this work and ensure grant dollars stay in the communities. Complex underlying issues require larger collaborations and funds. Right? This includes addressing upland forestry practices that promote increased flooding and sedimentation downstream, limited affordable housing availability, and upland development away from hazards. Federal representatives can be key advocates here. Federal elected officials are necessary partners to fund local work for U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and to authorize grant programs. Right? I can't underscore the importance here. Local jurisdictions and residents have taken the first steps to identify project concepts, but more federal funding is needed to finish these projects. And existing programs under the bipartisan infrastructure law provide a boost to these under-resourced communities, and we need to continue congressional support for community-focused grant programs and also directing appropriations for the Army Corps toward local priorities through the Water Resource Development Act. Next. There you go, thank you. So early stage action-oriented capacity building and planning grants can grow into many meaningful physical projects. All right, so this grant category is part of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's grant programs, and other grant programs could more effectively meet low capacity communities' needs by having similar grant categories. This approach is valuable to low capacity communities and is transferable to other locations too, or creates transferable approaches. Congressionally authorized grant programs provide stepping stones for state program development, right? This work built on years of federal, state, and local investments that are proving beneficial statewide. Beginning with grants from NOAA's Office of Coastal Management in 2016 and 2019, this led to tangible projects for our rural communities and beyond. And lastly, involvement of federally recognized tribes increases likelihood of effective hazards and habitat resilience projects. At the eastern upstream edges of our project area, the federally recognized Cowlitz tribe has led complex, large-scale flood reduction and habitat restoration work with long-term benefits for downstream communities and ecosystems. Similarly, the State Commission Washington Coastal Resilience Assessment highlighted the leadership of federally recognized tribes as a key leveraging point for coastal hazards resilience. However, most of this project area in the lower reaches of the river does not benefit from tribally focused federal funds and technical assistance, as the Chinook Indian Nation is not currently federally recognized. Next. In closing, over multiple engagement to action projects involving these partners since 2016, we've seen that local communities would be much less likely to develop resilience projects without local and state collaboration and federal funding support. One local collaborator said, "Our small city does not have resources such as these within our staffing capacities, so the support and outreach provided was invaluable." Another local community member said, it makes a big difference having people that really understand what it means working with us folks on the coast. This approach lets us share in driving the bus, so to speak, instead of the state coming in and asking us to ride to their predetermined destination. Next. Yeah, lastly, thanks for having me speak, and you can read the full report, project descriptions, and other updates at the website shown here. And my contact info is there too. And thanks again for having me speak as well as all of us.
Thank you, Jackson. That was a great presentation. And yes, people should definitely check out the report that Jackson referenced. We will have questions and answers. They're coming in. Thank you to everyone submitting questions in our online audience. We'll do our best to get to those. If you have a question, you can send us an email. And the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. That brings us to our fourth presenter of the day. Elaine Placido is the Executive Director of the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. Elaine joined the Estuary Partnership in 2020, leading a staff of 30 in building scientific tools and databases, restoring thousands of acres of habitat, instituting monitoring programs, providing applied learning to students, engaging thousands of volunteers in riparian plantings, and coordinating lower river activities. Elaine comes to the partnership with 20 plus years of local government experience and nonprofit experience, and is also a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard. Elaine, welcome to the briefing today. Thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to EESI for hosting the briefing, and to fellow panelists for sharing their knowledge about and dedication to the Columbia River. Thank you to the staff of our region's federal delegation for attending today, Senators Wyden, Merkley, Cantwell, Murray, and Representatives Gluesenkamp, Perez, Bonamici, Dexter, and Bynum. Next slide, please. I'm honored and excited to talk with you all about how the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership works to achieve its mission to restore and care for the waters and ecosystems of the Lower Columbia River for current and future generations of fish, wildlife, and people. But before I begin, I want to talk about how a few pieces of federal legislation that have made a tremendous impact on the Lower Columbia. The first is the National Estuary Program. In 1987, Congress amended Section 320 of the Clean Water Act to create the National Estuary Program. The National Estuary Program is housed within the EPA and serves as a place-based program that safeguards the country's most significant coastal ecosystems, along with the communities and economies that depend on them. The National Estuary Program is authorized to receive up to $50 million in funding annually from Congress. These funds are divided among individual national estuary programs and to a competitive grant program administered by the Restore America's Estuaries. However, the program has never received full funding authorized by Congress. The Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership and our sister national estuary programs want Congress to know that investing in the National Estuary Program generates a phenomenal return on investment. National Estuary Program organizations like the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership leverage the investment from Congress to secure additional funds from local, state, federal, and private sources to solve the most pressing problems to our estuaries. This results in a $17 return on investment for every $1 provided by Congress. And lastly, the National Estuary Program is supported by the bipartisan Congressional Estuary Caucus. There are nearly 24 House of Representative members of the Estuary Caucus, and in this last Congress, the caucus was co-chaired by Congressman Bill Posey, Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, Congressman Brian Mast, and Congressman Rick Larson. Next slide, please. A second piece of legislation that I would be remiss not to mention is the Columbia River Basin Restoration Program. Initially introduced a decade ago, this program was authorized by Congress in 2016. Funding for the program was slow, but thanks to our dedicated federal delegation, roughly $79 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funds have been allocated to it. Over the next few years, the impact from our program that was just a vision a few decades ago is going to be enormous. Our stormwater green infrastructure program, which I'll talk more about later, exists almost entirely because of funding from the Columbia River Basin Restoration Program. Next slide. Now it's time to bring this presentation back home. It's my honor and privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. We are structured as a 501c3 nonprofit, though not all national estuary programs operate this way. Some are housed within academic institutions or are part of a local or state government. Our origin came from the 1995 partnership of Oregon and Washington governors. They came together to jointly nominate the Lower Columbia River to EPA for National Estuary of National Significance status. This designation is a precursor to inclusion in the National Estuary Program. In 1999, the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership was incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit. Our study area begins at the estuary and extends to the Bonneville Dam, where the Pacific Ocean's tidal influence ends. We primarily work in that area and its adjacent watersheds. Like our sister national estuary programs, our mandate is to convene, collaborate, and guide the restoration of our respective estuaries. This is done through our EPA-approved comprehensive conservation and management plans, which are place-based and locally led. In the next few slides, I've pulled out several actions from our plan, though there are many more that I will leave off due to time. Next slide, please. Our comprehensive conservation and management plan gives our organization a clear mandate to focus on the next generation of leaders. This year, our education program will achieve a milestone, reaching over 100,000 students since the beginning of the program in 2000. During the less rainy season, using our 29-foot bright orange canoes that hold up to 14 people each, our educators create on-water classrooms that help students and community members connect with their watersheds in a whole new way. And in the rainy season, like right now, it is the best time to get new plants in the ground. Volunteers have installed nearly 120,000 native trees and shrubs through our volunteer program. These are wonderful events that attract families with young children, youth groups, and older folks looking to connect and build community. Next slide. This is the program that I mentioned earlier that truly exists because of the vision and goals of the Columbia River Basin Restoration Program. Our Rain Garden in a Box program and our Schoolyard Green Infrastructure Program are funded through EPA's Columbia River Basin Restoration Program. Right now, we have at least a dozen stormwater projects in some stage of planning, design, or construction, and that is only going to grow. Next slide, please. Consistent across all national estuary programs, we are tasked with convening agencies, universities, nonprofits, ports, and municipal governments and others to coordinate and collaborate on lower river issues. We do this in several ways, through our partnerships with Indigenous-led Columbia River-focused learning journeys for our staff, board, and partners, quarterly meetings of the Science Work Group, our Science to Policy Summits, and Columbia River Estuary Conference. This year, the Columbia River Estuary Conference will be May 13th through 15th, and details can be found on our website. Next slide. One of the biggest deficits in the lower Columbia River, and likely across all habitat restoration programs, is long-term monitoring. With partners, we conduct the only long-term ecosystem monitoring of both minimally disturbed and restored sites. These monitoring programs provide critical insight and information to restoration practitioners who will design future restoration projects, but it's currently limited to a handful of sites and lacks dedicated federal funding source. When BIL funds, bipartisan infrastructure law funds, were allocated to national estuary programs, we were quick to direct ours towards habitat monitoring and research. With partners, we are learning how the greenhouse gas cycle works on the lower Columbia River. This could help wetland restoration projects enter the carbon market and allow restoration ecologists to design projects to maximize carbon sequestration. This carbon study is very aligned with the bipartisan Coastal Restoration Act introduced by Representative Suzanne Bonamici and Representative Don Beyer last year. Next slide, please. Since 2000, the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership has fulfilled its responsibility to the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan by restoring over 5,000 acres of habitat, supporting partner restoration projects across 35,000 acres. Increasingly, we found our niche in habitat restoration to be focused on public land with multiple local, state, private, and federal stakeholders. As a 501c3, we are just enough of an outsider that we can work with nearly any entity. And as a national estuary program, we are just enough of an insider to gain access. I'll talk more about that on my next slide. Next slide, please. No Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership presentation could be done without mentioning the Steigerwald Reconnection Project. This is a prime example of how the Estuary Partnership's collaborative operational model allowed a railroad, a port, a nonprofit, and multiple federal agencies to come together to accomplish the largest habitat restoration project ever on the Lower Columbia River. It's a project that is deserving of its own presentation, but I'll just say that this is a project that solved major flooding issues for a port, increased recreational access to a wildlife refuge visited by over 100,000 people a year, and these two photos show the difference that this project made for salmon habitat. Next slide, please. My time is probably up here, but there are a few ways to learn more about our work. Thank you for taking the time to learn more about the Columbia River. If you ever want to see any of this work in action, please reach out to me. We are always excited for the chance to share our work with partners. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elaine. And if you have 14-person canoes, you could accommodate quite a few visitors at once. That's a big canoe. That's pretty cool. We have a fifth presenter today, and then we will turn our attention to questions. So continue sending in the questions. The email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. You can follow us on social media at EESI Online. And our final presenter today is Sarah Dyrdahl. Sarah is the Northwest Region Director for American Rivers. Sarah leads the regional team working to protect wild rivers, restore damaged rivers, and conserve clean water for people and nature in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. Sarah has been working with communities on river conservation and restoration in Alaska and Oregon since 2004 and is a staff biologist for a Native Alaskan tribe. I don't know why this is so blurry to me right now. Sarah's been working with communities on river conservation and restoration in Alaska and Oregon since 2004. That's the number one thing. And that was as a staff biologist for a Native Alaskan tribe. It's too many commas. We added too many commas to your bio, Sarah. And for 15 years as a restoration program manager and then executive director for Oregon Watershed Councils. Most recently, Sarah served as the aquatic and riparian specialist and interim deputy division chief for the Oregon Department of Forestry. Sorry for butchering your bio, but your presentation will be so great that no one will even remember that I was even here today. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Dan. And thanks to my other co-presenters today and the team at EESI for putting on this really important talk. And thanks to those in attendance for your interest in the Columbia River Basin. So I'm Sarah Dyrdahl, the Northwest Region Director at American Rivers, and I am delighted to tell you about some of our work in the Columbia Basin, which is home for me. I live in Eugene, Oregon on the Willamette River, which is one of the Columbia River's tributaries. Next slide, please. So before I dive into what we do at American Rivers, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I am guided for my love of the Pacific Northwest, the place, the people, the culture. And I love this quote from Tim Egan's The Good Rain. He says, "The Pacific Northwest is simply this, wherever the salmon can get to. Rivers without salmon have lost the life source of the area." And as the salmon go, so do the southern resident orca whale. This is a photo, a recent photo of one of the southern resident orca whale mothers, Taliqua, and her calf from a few days ago. This calf is deceased, and this orca mother is carrying this deceased calf now for the second time for multiple days. It's a truly heartbreaking situation for us here in the Northwest. So with a population of less than 75 animals remaining, these orcas rely exclusively on salmon populations as their food source, preferring Chinook salmon to other species. And so in 2018, we mourned with Taliqua when she carried her dead calf for 17 days over 1,000 miles. And unfortunately, on New Year's Eve, this couple weeks ago, it was confirmed that another of her calves had died. She was last seen on January 10th, and she'd been carrying that new dead calf for at least 11 days. As a parent and someone who wants my grandkids to experience these powerful, curious, and majestic creatures, I mourn with her and am compelled to shift her fate. Next slide. So why rivers? Rivers are the arteries of our country, supplying 70% of our drinking water, providing habitat for over 80% of species, and yet freshwater species are declining at nearly twice the rate that land species are. Next slide. American Rivers has the privilege of working locally, regionally, and nationally to solve problems for healthy rivers and healthy communities. This slide nicely summarizes our work to protect the highest quality remaining rivers in the country, while also working to restore damaged rivers through increasing connectivity. For example, we know that removing a dam is the fastest way to heal a river. We're seeing this on the Klamath River, where immediately after the last dam came down, salmon returned for the first time in over 100 years. Next slide. The work of protecting and restoring rivers has grown increasingly complex, and the only way to solve complex problems is through collaboration. I'm going to share a few examples of successful collaboration on the Columbia today, which I find a lot of hope in. Next slide. So first is the Kellogg Creek Restoration and Community Enhancement Project. This is a multi-benefit dam removal project here in the Willamette River Basin near my home. This dam is at the confluence of the Willamette River and Kellogg Creek, and has created an impoundment upstream with contaminated soils, poor water quality, and currently sits behind cyclone fencing from the downtown city park. Highway 99, a major transportation artery in Oregon, sits on top of the dam, as you can see in the photo on the right. Next slide. This project is powered by people who together secured over $15 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funding for the design and sediment sampling work, and recently secured another $10 million in Metro Regional Government funding for construction. Next slide. So, like so many others, this dam is a story of abandoned and obsolete infrastructure where the dam no longer fulfills its intended purpose and was simply left on the landscape for others to address down the road. And this would have been a much cheaper project had the dam come down when it was no longer needed. Next slide. So I'm just going to briefly describe the project objectives here. I could spend a lot of time talking about Kellogg, but we're looking at getting volitional fish passage to 17 miles of river. So that's where fish can freely move up and downstream on their own accord. We're looking to modernize the Highway 99 bridge and make it safe for our modern issues. We're looking to restore the floodplain behind the dam infrastructure where the impoundment is. And what I love the most about this project are the community enhancement features and how the community is involved in designing this. It's creating jobs, it's creating a learning laboratory right downtown next to the high school, and the lovely green space that they're visioning for themselves and their community. Next slide. So here's a glimmer of the conceptual restoration design where the free-flowing river, a restored floodplain and green space will become a city amenity rather than a hazard and an eyesore. Next slide. The next collaboration I want to highlight is that of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, and this is literally a story of going from litigation to partnership, where partners are now working to build a future for water, wildlife, and working lands in the Yakima Basin. Next slide. So initially authorized by Congress in 1979 and through several subsequent congressional commitments, what has resulted is this, starting in 2009, this diverse group of interests in the basin coming together with a desire to build a framework for resource management that would address the community's needs and put long-standing conflicts over water and fisheries behind them. The Yakima Basin was born at that time and is considered a common sense and pragmatic approach. Next slide. The plan has 7 elements. I'm not going to go into those today, but the magic in this plan is that everyone in the partnership advocates for each of the 7 elements in the plan. And that is sort of its secret to success, is that everybody at the table recognizes the holistic solution that's required and are advocating together for this plan. Next slide. Another great example of collaboration is the Uncommon Dialogue. This is housed at Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment, and it's included non-governmental organizations, hydropower companies, trade associations, government agencies, universities, investors, and more. And this has created a table where kind of unlikely partners have come together and reached alignment on what they call the 3 R's, which is to rehabilitate dams for improved public safety and environmental performance, to retrofit powered and non-powered dams for increased generation, and removing obsolete dams that are harming ecosystems, causing safety risks, and impeding recreation. Next slide. So why does this matter? Why do we need collaborations like this? And I'm going to share with you what we call internally our red rash map of dams in the United States. And what we know is that we have over 500,000 dams in the United States and counting. And so in order to address a problem at this magnitude, and remember that several of these have outlived their intended purpose or utility, we need to have conversations across difference with folks about how do we create a future where we can address these large-scale problems. Next slide. So I'm going to begin I'm going to end where Jeremy began and acknowledge that all of these collaborations that you've heard of today for both my presentation and my fellow panelists are all great. And those of us that work in the Northwest recognize that we need to move bigger dials at a faster pace. And so I want to highlight again this Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative as this historic partnership with local leadership that provides us a blueprint for how we can honor treaty rights, recover salmon and orca, and create a brighter future for the Northwest. Next slide. And with that, I just want to thank EESI again for this panel, and I look forward to the questions and discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And yes, now we're going to shift gears to questions. They're coming in, so thank you to folks in our online audience. We'll have a few that I think will be really good. In case you're joining us a little late or you missed this a little bit earlier, we started with a 5th panelist at the beginning, Jeremy Takala. Jeremy had to leave us during the briefing. So if you have a question for Jeremy, you can contact us and we'll do our best to get it to him. But for the Q&A that we'll do now, we'll hear from Miles, Jackson, Elaine, and Sarah. And so the first question, this one is one that came in from our online audience. The first question I would like to pose to the group, and Miles, it's been a little while since we've heard from you, so maybe we could start with you and then we can give Jackson and Elaine and Sarah an opportunity to comment as well. And that has to do with something that I commented on in my intro, which was, this can't, not all perspectives can fit into every EESI briefing, and the issue of hydropower is one that we have referred to, but it's not represented on the panel today. And in the Pacific Northwest, people rely on hydropower for energy, but also pump storage to help reduce or to help mitigate the intermittency of other renewable resources. It's a big part of the energy mix. And I'm curious to hear from the panel sort of your perspectives on how your organizations approach finding a balance between river health and the health of the communities along the river, as well as the need for affordable, reliable, and zero carbon energy for the people who inhabit those communities. Miles, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'll try not to take too long, although you could spend a long time on this. I think it's a great question. It's, the question that we get over and over again from not just congressional offices or leaders, but from our members too. Our members live throughout the Pacific Northwest. They use power, they use hydropower, and they also care deeply about mitigating the effects of climate change alongside restoring healthy salmon populations. So how to balance those is, really the dilemma for our region. And I want to go back to something that Councilman Takala said. I think the key word in that question is balance. How do we balance those two things? And I just want to set the table on what balancing looks like. And, I don't mean to use hyperbole, but the federal and private hydropower industries have bent the Columbia River to their will. There are dams throughout the watershed that have created huge opportunities for hydropower. At the same time, we have lost, huge portions of our salmon and steelhead populations throughout the upper Snake and upper Columbia Basin. The remaining salmon and steelhead populations, with a few notable exceptions, are in, bad to critical condition. So when it comes to striking a balance, I think the place, one thing we need to recognize is that we're badly out of balance. We are in jeopardy of losing what remains of our salmon and steelhead runs. With that said, I think we need to recognize that hydropower is not monolithic. Not all dams are the same. And so striking that balance in a way that restores salmon, but retains as much of the hydropower benefits as we can get, involves looking for opportunities where, dams have become obsolete or dams have become non-profitable, or in some cases where the dams that we have in place have, the benefits of those dams are now so far outweighed by what we understand about the needs of salmon, the needs of the river, that it's time to replace those services of those dams and move on. I think the Snake River dams fall into that category. But I just want to reiterate that, we're facing a real crisis for salmon recovery. And I think there are real opportunities to continue dam removal efforts, dam improvement efforts, and redraw that balance in a way that actually takes care of a lot of communities without, totally dismantling every dam in the basin. I would be remiss also if I didn't speak to one of the premises of that question, which is, are dams zero carbon sources of energy? They are not. I think there's a narrative out there that they are. We have 20 years of science saying, and, especially from the lower Snake River, we have, on the ground studies saying reservoirs produce methane. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. Each individual reservoir is different, and so is their methane emission signature. But, if you look at lower Snake River dams, the power they produce on a per kilowatt basis, is it as bad as burning coal? No. Is it as good as wind or solar? Absolutely not. And, if our goal in Oregon and Washington is carbon neutrality, we need to think about how dams fit into that mix. So, yeah, I'll pass that to whoever else wants to weigh in.
Great, thanks. Jackson, you can go next if you'd like, and then we'll hear from Elaine and Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. So while the communities I serve are further downstream than any of the dams, right? It's not something that or the major dams on the Columbia. It's not a realm we work in much. However, I think it's important to note that, to your first question around transferability, right? Around multiple benefits. One of our big goals is working around balancing that wildlife and community needs there. And, that all starts with listening, right? Showing up, building trust. A lot of that takes multiple, years, sometimes working with people across multiple generations even, and looking at how communication happens there. So developing those long-term approaches to issues and focusing on the overlaps between different parties' interests, right? And that's in line with our conservation district's methods of voluntary stewardship, right? We are not a regulatory entity. With regard to clean energy and hydropower, I think it's oftentimes when we talk about hydropower, we forget the impacts on the communities at the mouth of the river, right? I think that oftentimes we think of the river stopping at the mouth of it too, right? The sediment and freshwater plumes continue into the ocean, and that's part of a larger system that the littoral cell, right? That we often forget. There's fishing dependent communities. Ilwaco is a great example. That has in town of Chinook as well, that have been reliant on the fisheries since time immemorial, and then on into the actual formation of those towns in the past centuries. So thinking of where those communities' reliance on fisheries goes, and what that means for the sustainability and the livability of those communities and those fish numbers, and the way they're managed, and then also along with that is thinking of going once the river plume leaves the mouth of the Columbia, right? Thinking of those dams and control structures have effects much further downstream than we think of, and that's been tied to erosion and accretion issues out on the coast of Pacific County and Oregon as well, and so hazards impacts. We have the fastest eroding shoreline and the whole west coast of the United States in Pacific County, and that that is all tied. Also thinking of the dams and control structures have been hypothesized as a factor in increased populations of nuisance species affecting the shellfish farming. For one out of 4 shellfish consumed in the United States comes from Willapa Bay right there. So it's big issues and trying to tie together all this. It's complex. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackson. Elaine?
Thanks. Tough question. So much like what Jackson just mentioned, our work is primarily done downriver, the Bonneville Dam, but the environment that we work in is greatly impacted by the dams. We complete our work in the environment that we're in, which includes those dams. Unfortunately, that means we work against the challenges that system creates. Top of mind is the lack of cold water refugia for migrating fish. Small improvements in our lower river, like the Dyrdahl restoration project that I mentioned in my presentation. Completing as many of those projects as we can. And prioritizing projects that have the biggest impact for habitat and communities in the lower river is probably the most logical way for us to address that balance or lack of balance created by dams in the system.
And Sarah, give you a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, lots of really good points, and thank you for the question. It's probably the thing that keeps many of us up at night the most. Who are working on these issues. And I think that, Miles's point of balance is a really important one. And I just want to point towards how we're trying to think about this in terms of the future. So we know that we've got increasing energy demands coming to the Northwest. We have to plan for that. And we need to consider the current infrastructure and what is needed to deliver the energy needs of the future. We also need to think of that holistically with the impacts that those facilities have on both tribal cultures, on salmon, et cetera. And so this requires, similar to what Jackson alluded to, which is this idea of having these conversations in a holistic framework so that we can actually solve for these problems collectively. This is not a problem that's going to be solved in a silo. And I will just offer that the technologies are modernizing by the day in terms of solutions and opportunities that we haven't seen before to really make our infrastructure better. And that's what American Rivers is really committed to, is how do we make this infrastructure better for the future that we're expecting, such that we can have both reasonable, clean energy, cheap, clean energy, affordable, clean energy, balanced with healthy communities and healthy rivers. And so that's where the conversation needs to happen. And I'll just point lastly to the work of the tribes, and Jeremy's not here any longer, but CritFic has an incredible energy vision document that is a really great resource on how to approach these issues. And so there's a lot of really good work out there to help us solve this really tough problem. Thanks.
Thanks. And you just reminded me, Sarah, we have also posted a bunch of resources on the briefing page that were recommended by you all and Jeremy. So we'll make sure with Jeremy's permission that we post a link or a PDF or something of that report if you'd like to recommend that to our audience today. So we have a couple other questions that I would like to make sure we get to because they're from congressional staff. I won't give them away, but they are. The first one might be, well, I don't know, I'm not sure, but it might be a quick hit one. And so let's make this maybe a grab bag. The question is about efforts to modernize the Columbia River Treaty and ratify a new treaty with Canada as soon as possible. Could anyone provide a status update on the treaty? And do you think the treaty agreement in principle, or the AIP, will be finalized before the end of the Biden administration, which is Monday at 11:59 a.m.? So does anyone have a comment on the status of the treaty, or maybe if no one does, maybe where this person could maybe go to get an answer on that? And it's for anyone who would like to chime in, please feel free. All right.
I do not have an update. I think, in terms of NGOs that track this very closely, I know Save Our Wild Salmon has been, helping to lead coordination on that. So they would be a good resource. I think for congressional office, the State Department is your best resource. It's been difficult to penetrate that bubble for NGOs, frankly, in this process. I will say briefly that I think the agreement in principle does not do enough or really much at all to rectify the fact that we made an agreement about how to operate the river without significant thought to how those operations impact the ecology and the fisheries of the river. We hope that changes in the future. In terms of what will happen in the final days of this administration, I have no idea.
Well, that was a good attempt at an answer. I appreciate that you chimed in with that, and good suggestions. And for the person who asked the question in our online audience, thanks for the question as well. And hopefully Miles' response helps point you in the right direction to get to an answer. The next question, we have about 5 minutes or so left. The next question, I think maybe this one would make sense maybe to Sarah to start with you, and then we can go kind of in the reverse order if you'd like. And the question is, are there any policy efforts on your radar screen? And let's expand this. So let's say local, state, or federal policy efforts that you think over the course of the next 4 years could deliver benefits and be successful for Columbia River restoration that Congress might be aware of, might not be aware of, but should be aware of.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and it's a really good one. I think the commitments to the Columbia River or Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative is a big one that is on our radar in terms of the needed funding, the continued availability of things like the bipartisan infrastructure law that has just been tremendous for benefits to the Columbia River Basin. Jeremy mentioned in his talk at the outset about just the monetary investment that's required to address the problems that are in the Columbia Basin, and that includes a federal government commitment to find those solutions. And so I think that looking at modernizing infrastructure and funding projects that have these multi-benefit components to them really just has this opportunity to benefit our communities in the Columbia River Basin and set us up on a trajectory for increased and continued success. Thanks.
Thanks. Elaine, policy efforts, proposals, initiatives, subnational, national, anything that you kind of see in the, in movement that Congress should be aware of in the next couple of years?
Sure, I'd be remiss not to mention reauthorization of the National Estuary Program coming up in hopefully 2026. So that'll be important for us. I think the amount of funding that the bipartisan infrastructure law brought to the Columbia and our ability to do just really fantastic collaborative projects just not be understated. The funding for the Columbia River Basin Restoration Program, which covers the entire basin, came from the bipartisan infrastructure law. When that expires in 2 years, where will that next bit of funding come from to be able to complete the huge width and depth of programs that has been undertaken in the last 3 years? So I'll be looking hopefully to see what comes next.
Jackson?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I have to clarify that these the points I'll make do not reflect any formal statements or position of Pacific Conservation District or our Board of Supervisors. Kind of rehashing some of the points I brought up earlier. I think the bipartisan infrastructure law and the grant authorizations that align with that are specifically ones that we see as ones that have been aligned with furthering community resilience and habitat resilience in the area. Secondly, the authorization of the Water Resource Development Act with the Army Corps of Engineers and the appropriation of funding for that, right, is really important for us. Specifically, one act around the or one piece of that with regards to a flood control study of the Grays River area, something that came out of or is related to the work we were presented on. And then another one that has also been discussed at the federal level is the federal recognition of the Chinook Indian Nation, which is another piece that would be bringing more funds and resources to our area on this topic.
Thank you, Jackson. Miles, final word I think goes to you. Any state, local, federal initiatives or policy efforts that you see coming down the tracks or flowing down the river next couple of years?
Sure. I'll just say a quick plug. Because our water and energy resources are so closely connected. As a lot of you know, Oregon and Washington have gone through big processes to set goals and requirements for phasing out fossil fuels and getting to climate neutrality. Those efforts have already required a lot of work at the state level. At the federal level, I think it's really important that we support those efforts, and that can look like a lot of different things, but we need federal policy leadership on energy regulation in the Columbia Basin. It's awfully hard to in the case of Oregon wean ourselves off of fossil fuels when FERC or other federal regulators are continuing to essentially kind of ignore Oregon's goals and authorize expansions of fossil fuel infrastructure. So that's all connected to our energy infrastructure, which runs through the Columbia River Basin and through the Columbia River itself. Just a quick plug that Oregon and Washington are doing great work in that respect, but they need support at the federal level.
All right. Well, thank you. I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap it. It is, at least by my watch, it's 3:30. I would like to thank everyone who asked us a question, our online audience. And a big thanks to our 5 tremendous speakers today. Still with us are Miles, Jackson, Elaine, and Sarah. Thank you for joining us. Also, huge thanks to Jeremy Takala from the chair of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission for joining us earlier in our briefing today and sharing his perspectives on all of these issues. This is the first briefing of 2025. Great place to start. And all of our briefings really are dependent on people like you all, experts, practitioners, leaders, coming, using our forums. But ultimately, we're here to hear you and to learn from you. And thanks so much for sharing your time with us today. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at EESI. I'd like to thank Dan O, Amory, Allison, Anna, Molly, and Nicole and for all of their help. This is also the first briefing of our spring intern season. So thanks to Raneem for joining us. We have a few more interns coming in a couple weeks. I think they'll be here for the first climate camp on January 29th. This is also the first briefing for our newest colleague. Hannah Wilson-Black is joining us as our new communications associate. So thanks, Hannah, for your contributions leading up to today, and especially going forward. Also in the background, lurking is Troy, our videographer. Thank you, Troy, for working with us for another year to bring our briefings to the widest possible audience. I'd like to close with 3 last plugs. One, we will be kicking off Congressional Climate Camp 2 weeks from today. We're going to be learning about climate modeling and reviewing sort of drivers of climate change and what can be done. It's going to be very interactive. It's going to be in person. It's going to be on Capitol Hill. You will not want to miss it. It is going to be fantastic. Definitely encourage everyone to sign up for that briefing. We'll also be covering the budget and appropriations and reconciliation process. We'll be covering an overview of the national labs, which are doing tremendous work across the climate space and other spaces. And then we will also be doing a climate camp on Surface Transportation 101. That is something that will be taking up a lot of bandwidth in Congress over the next 2 years or so. And we want to make sure staff have some perspective and some background knowledge about how that has worked in the past. The best way to keep up with everything that we do at EESI, including our briefings, including our articles, our fact sheets, our podcast, everything, is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. You can do that. You can RSVP for all the briefings if you visit us online at www.eesi.org. We'll put up a final slide. This is with the QR code for the survey. You have a few moments to take our survey. We really appreciate it. Any and all feedback about the briefing today is absolutely welcome. We read every response. And it really means a lot when folks take a few minutes to share their thoughts. So once again, thank you to our panelists. Thanks for helping us get our congressional education programming underway for the 119th Congress. I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday. If you're in the DC area, bundle up because it's still pretty chilly out there. And we'll be back in 2 weeks on the Hill for the first installment of Congressional Climate Camp. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.